A retired police officer took his loyal German Shepherd for a quiet walk through the snowy woods of Pine Creek. But hours later, that same dog came running back alone, leading 2 children deep into the forest to something they would never forget. Beneath the falling snow lay the old officer, barely breathing, his badge half buried in blood and ice. He wasn't supposed to be there, and what those children did next would uncover a secret buried for years beneath the pines. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. You. The morning fog drifted low across Pine Creek, Montana. That pale, silver mist that seemed to hush the world. The mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their peaks veiled in clouds, and the tall pines stood solemn, weighed down by the remnants of last night's snow. It was early February, the kind of cold that cracked the air and made each breath look like ghost smoke. Sergeant Henry Lawson moved steadily along the narrow ridge trail, his boots creaking in the frost. At 58, he still carried himself like the lawman he once was. Tall, broad-shouldered with weathered skin, and eyes the color of worn steel. His gray hair was cut short, his face lined not just from age, but from too many winters spent chasing other people's mistakes. Henry had been Pine Creek's police chief for 15 years before retiring. The town had thrown him a ceremony, gave him a plaque, and for a while, everyone assumed he'd learn to rest. But rest didn't suit him. The silence of retirement gnawed at him more than danger ever did. He spent his days tending to his old cabin at the edge of the forest, and his nights walking trails that only ghosts remembered. His only companion was Rex, a 6-year-old German Shepherd, large and powerful with a coat of sable black and tan and eyes bright amber in the morning light. Rex had once trained as a K9 search and rescue dog but had been retired early after a hip injury. Henry adopted him from the unit without hesitation. 2 old servants of duty, both cast aside by time. Rex walked slightly ahead now, nose to the ground, body tense but controlled. Every few steps he glanced back, checking that Henry was close behind. They were out early after a report from hunters who'd seen headlights in the forest at night, a possible sign of illegal logging or poaching. Pine Creek had always been quiet, but Henry knew how quickly quiet could change. The trail curved down into a small ravine where snow lay deeper. Henry paused, scanning the slope. The smell of oil drifted faintly through the crisp air. Rex sniffed, ears pricking forward. "Yeah, I smell it too," Henry muttered. His voice was rough, low, as though unused to speech. Through the fog, a glint of metal caught his eye. Half buried beneath a tangle of branches and snow sat an old pickup truck, its tailgate rusted and windshield frosted over. Steam no longer rose from the engine, but the hood was still warm to the touch. Henry approached cautiously, hand resting near his sidearm, though these days he carried it more out of habit than need. The driver's door was open a crack, the footprints leading away already half filled with snow. Inside he spotted a torn glove and a small toolbox with no lock. A faint trail of dark drops, oil, maybe something else, led deeper into the woods. Rex let out a low growl. Henry froze. Years of instinct woke up all at once. He turned slightly, and in that same instant, the silence shattered. A single gunshot echoed through the valley, sharp and merciless. Henry felt the impact in his shoulder before he heard the sound. The force spun him halfway around. His knees buckled, the cold rushing in as if the mountain itself had swallowed him. He fell hard into the snow. His breath came ragged and fast, fogging the air. Rex barked, loud, furious, protective. Henry tried to lift his radio, but his fingers were numb. "Go! Rex! Go!" he gasped. Rex hesitated, whining, then darted off through the trees, following the smell of blood and gunpowder. Henry rolled onto his back, pressing a hand to his wound. Above him, the branches blurred against a sky gone white. Somewhere, the echo of that rifle shot bounced through the valley, then faded into silence. Half a mile away, the forest looked softer. Tommy Brooks, 12 years old, trudged through the snow pulling a small sled piled with pine branches. His jacket was 2 winters too small, his brown hair wild beneath his wool cap, and his cheeks were flushed from the cold. He complained under his breath about school projects that make no sense, but his sister, Ellie, barely listened. Ellie Brooks, 10, was shorter, lighter on her feet, with curious hazel eyes that always seemed to notice what others missed. She carried a small vintage camera, its strap worn and frayed, a keepsake from her late father, a volunteer firefighter who had died years earlier. Ellie said the camera helped her find the good things hiding behind sad ones. She snapped photos of everything: frost patterns, animal tracks, the reflection of the sun on snow. Their mother, Sarah Brooks, had sent them out early to gather pine branches for a craft fair at the local school. Sarah, 35, was a woman built on quiet strength. She was tall and slender, with soft brown hair and hands calloused from years of baking. She ran the small bakery on Main Street, the one that smelled of cinnamon and hope, even when money ran short. Losing her husband had carved something out of her, but what remained was resilience. Her motto was simple: keep moving, keep believing. Back in the woods, Tommy sighed. "Ellie, hurry up, it's freezing." But Ellie had stopped. She tilted her head, listening. A faint sound echoed through the trees, a bark, distant but sharp. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Tommy frowned. "Probably a coyote." The bark came again, louder, desperate. Ellie's eyes widened. "No, that's a dog." They exchanged a glance and, without another word, began to follow the sound. The path narrowed as they pushed through the snow, branches brushing their sleeves. Then, from the mist ahead, a figure burst through, a German shepherd, panting heavily, snow clinging to his fur. Rex. He skidded to a stop before them, eyes locked on Ellie's, tail stiff. Then he barked once, commanding, and took off again, glancing back as if urging them to follow. Ellie hesitated for only a second. "Come on, Tommy." They ran after him, slipping on the uneven snow, hearts pounding. The fog thickened, swallowing their breath. Then, suddenly, they saw it, a clearing by the frozen creek, the snow stained with red. Henry Lawson lay motionless against a fallen tree, his uniform dark with blood. His radio was cracked beside him. Rex circled back, whining, then stood protectively by his side. Tommy froze in shock. "Is he?" Ellie didn't let him finish. She dropped to her knees beside the man, her mitten pressing to his shoulder. The blood was warm, terrifyingly real. "Tommy, help me." He knelt beside her, trembling, trying to remember what his mother had always said: "If something happens, breathe first, then act." He pulled off his scarf and pressed it against the wound. Ellie's eyes flicked to the trees. Movement. For a split second, she saw someone, a shadow darting through the fog, and without thinking, she raised her camera and clicked. The flash cut through the mist like lightning. Then the figure vanished. Rex barked low, his hackles rising, positioning himself between the children and the forest. The tension broke only when Henry stirred, a faint groan escaping his lips. "He's alive," Ellie whispered. Relief flooded her voice, but her hands didn't stop pressing. The snow fell heavier now, muting the world. The 3 of them, 2 frightened children and a wounded old officer, sat together in the silent heart of Pine Creek, the loyal dog standing guard like a sentinel carved from courage. For the first time in years, the forest seemed to breathe again. The wind had begun to howl through the valley, sweeping fine snow into the air like ash from an unseen fire. The once still forest now groaned under the weight of the storm. Ellie pressed her red scarf harder against Henry's shoulder, her hands trembling but firm. The blood kept seeping through the fabric, blooming darkly against the crimson wool. Beside her, Tommy fumbled with the small flip phone their mother made them carry, just in case. His gloved fingers slipped over the buttons, breath quick and shallow as he stared at the blinking signal bar that kept vanishing. "Come on," he muttered, holding the phone high toward the sky. For a moment, one bar appeared, then died again. He cursed under his breath, something he'd learned from the older boys at school but never dared say near his mom. Rex barked once, low and sharp as if warning him to keep calm. Ellie glanced at her brother. "Does it work?" "Sometimes," Tommy said. "Right now, not so much." Snow began falling faster, thick flakes swirling in wild, circular gusts. The air felt heavy, the kind of cold that bites straight to the bone. Ellie looked down at the man lying before them. His skin had turned pale, almost gray, his breaths shallow. His badge was half hidden beneath his jacket, glinting faintly under the dim light. Tommy looked around, his mind racing. He remembered what his mother had told him more than once. "When you panic, the world gets smaller. Breathe first, then do something." He took a deep breath and said, "We can't stay out here. We'll freeze." Ellie nodded. "There's a cave near the creek, the one we used last summer when it rained. It's not far." Tommy's eyes flicked to the man's limp form. "He's heavy. We'll drag him. We have to." It took all their strength. They looped Henry's arms over the sled, which creaked under the weight, and began pulling him through the deepening snow. Rex walked beside them, nudging occasionally when they stumbled. His fur was dusted with white, but his focus never wavered. The storm thickened, turning the world into a blur of gray and white. By the time they reached the cave, their faces were raw from the wind and their hands numb. The small shelter was carved naturally into the hillside, barely big enough for the three of them and Rex, but it was dry and shielded from the worst of the storm. They laid Henry near the back wall where the air was slightly warmer. Ellie immediately began searching for kindling. Broken twigs, dry leaves, anything. Tommy struck a match from a small tin his father used to carry on camping trips. His hands shook, but the flame caught on the first try, flickering weakly before growing into a small, shivering fire. The light cast golden shadows across the stone walls. Rex settled beside Henry, curling his body close to share warmth, his ears twitching with every gust of wind outside. Ellie removed her soaked gloves, rubbing her palms together before pressing them gently against Henry's arm. "He's so cold," she whispered. Tommy nodded, feeding the fire with more sticks. The crackling sound was comforting. Fragile, but alive. Henry stirred faintly, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at the children for a brief moment, confusion clouding his gaze. "Where?" His voice rasped, barely audible. "You're safe," Ellie said softly. "We found you by the creek. You're hurt, but help is coming." Henry blinked slowly, trying to focus. "Rex?" The dog lifted his head immediately, tail thumping once against the cave floor. Henry exhaled, a faint ghost of a smile on his lips, before slipping back into half-consciousness. Ellie stared at him, her chest tightening. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. "My dad used to help people too. He was a firefighter." Her voice wavered, but she kept talking as if to keep both him and herself awake. He didn't make it back one night. Mom said he saved 3 people, though. That's what she tells me when I miss him." Tommy listened in silence, staring into the flames. Outside, the storm roared like an angry sea, shaking loose snow from the trees above. Ellie glanced toward the cave's mouth where wind howled through the narrow opening. "Do you think Mom's worried?" Tommy nodded. "Yeah, probably." Back in town, Sarah Brooks paced the narrow floor of her kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. The smell of overbaked bread filled the small room, though she hadn't noticed the smoke curling from the oven. Her apron was dusted with flour, her hair pulled into a tight bun, and her eyes, those gentle hazel eyes, were sharp with fear. She looked at the phone again. Still no messages. The sun had disappeared behind thick clouds, and snow had begun to fall hard against the windows. She tried to steady herself, breathing the way she taught her children to when things went wrong. Her neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, an elderly widow with a kind face and a voice like warm honey, tapped on the window before letting herself in. She wore a thick knitted coat the color of old roses and carried a thermos in her hands. "Sarah, you look like you're about to collapse. Sit for a moment." Sarah shook her head. "They should have been home hours ago. Tommy always calls." Mrs. Calloway's smile faltered. "The storm came fast. Maybe they're sheltering somewhere safe. That boy's smart." Sarah pressed her lips together, fighting the rising panic. She had lost one person she loved to fire. She would not lose her children to ice. She picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's office. The line crackled before a calm voice answered. Deputy Morgan Hale leaned over his desk at the Pine Creek station, a man in his early 30s with sharp gray eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. His uniform was crisp despite the late hour, his posture straight as if discipline were a second skin. Hale had grown up under Henry Lawson's mentorship, back when he was just a patrol rookie with something to prove. To him, Henry wasn't just a superior. He was the man who taught him what integrity meant. "Deputy Hale speaking." "Deputy, this is Sarah Brooks. My kids, Tommy and Ellie, they went to the forest this morning, near the South Trail. They haven't come back." Hale's hand tightened around the receiver. "How long have they been gone?" "Since before noon. I've tried calling. Nothing. And this storm—" Her voice cracked. Hale straightened, already reaching for his coat. "I'll send a search team immediately, ma'am. Stay by the phone in case they try to reach you." He hung up and turned to the duty sergeant. "Get the snow vehicles ready. We're heading to the South Ridge." As he gathered his gear, something in his gut twisted. Just that morning, Henry had told him he was going to check the same area, where hunters had seen strange lights. Hale had waved him off, saying he'd handle it later. Now, both Henry and the children were unaccounted for, and the storm was tightening its grip. He glanced at the radio on his desk. The static hummed faintly, broken by a single garbled tone, an emergency ping from the South Woods. He frowned. The signal was weak, but there. Someone, or something, was trying to call for help. In the cave, the world had shrunk to the small circle of firelight. Henry's breathing was shallow but steady. Tommy wrapped his own jacket over him, shivering as cold air crept into the corners. Rex stayed pressed close, his fur warm against Henry's side. Ellie leaned her head against the cave wall, exhaustion pulling at her eyelids, but she refused to sleep. Outside, the wind screamed louder, swallowing every sound of life. Yet beneath that chaos, there was a strange peace, the kind that comes only in the eye of a storm. The children didn't know it yet, but their small fire had become a beacon in the dark, and somewhere beyond the white veil of snow, a team was already preparing to find them. The storm had become a living thing, a roar of wind and snow that swallowed the forest whole. It howled through the trees, bending them like reeds, tearing at the edges of the cave where the children huddled beside the fire. The flame flickered wildly, shrinking lower each time the wind found a crack to crawl through. Tommy sat near it, feeding in thin branches one by one, his face pale with exhaustion and focus. The faint light painted his cheeks in gold and shadow. Behind him, Henry lay still, breath shallow, his body covered with both children's coats. Rex rested at his side, chest rising slowly, eyes half closed but alert, every muscle waiting. Ellie had fallen quiet. She sat near the mouth of the cave, her back pressed against the stone wall, listening. It wasn't just the wind. Somewhere beyond the storm's scream, she heard something else. The faint rhythm of voices, low, harsh, human. She turned her head slightly, holding her breath. The words came broken through the wind. "Buried here, before sunrise." Her heart raced. She looked back toward her brother. Tommy hadn't noticed. The crackle of the fire and the storm's rage drowned everything else. Ellie rose carefully, clutching her small vintage camera, and stepped toward the cave's entrance. The cold hit her like a slap, stealing her breath. Snowflakes stung her face as she crouched low and crept behind a cluster of fir trees, her boots sinking silently into the snow. Through the curtain of white, two silhouettes moved, men in thick coats, their faces hidden by scarves. One carried a shovel, the other held a lantern that swayed in the wind. They were digging under an old pine, the trunk thick as a house beam. Between their boots lay a stack of burlap sacks, heavy, stained, tied tight with cord. Ellie could hear them laughing, their words carried by the gusts. "Told you the old cop wouldn't last the night," one said, his voice rough and careless. The other snorted. "A shame, really. He was good at sticking his nose where it didn't belong." They both laughed again, a sound that made Ellie's stomach twist. Her hands trembled, but she raised the camera, switching it to video mode. The tiny red light blinked. She zoomed in, catching their faces between bursts of snow. Her heart hammered. "You can do this," she told herself. "Mom always says evidence matters more than fear." She steadied her hands and filmed as the men finished burying the sacks, wiping snow over the disturbed ground. "We'll come back when it clears," the first man muttered. "No one's going to find this. The old man's done." Ellie's eyes stung, not from the cold but from something sharper. Anger, disbelief. She thought of Henry's gray face back in the cave, of Tommy trying to keep him alive. Then it happened. The light from her camera blinked again, brighter this time as she shifted position. The man with the lantern turned sharply. "Hey!" he barked. The beam of light caught her red beanie. "Someone's there!" Ellie gasped, stumbling backward, snow flying from her boots. The men started running. She turned and bolted toward the cave, clutching the camera to her chest. Branches whipped her face, the storm cutting her vision down to shadows and light. She could hear them behind her. Heavy boots, breath, curses. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, the camera tumbling into the snow. She scrambled to grab it, but one of the men was already closing in, reaching for her arm. Then a roar ripped through the storm. Not wind, not thunder, but something alive. Rex. The German shepherd exploded out of the white, his body a streak of black and tan against the snow. He slammed into the man's side, teeth flashing, the sound of fury and devotion all at once. The man shouted in pain, falling backward as Rex bit down on his arm. The second man swung a metal tool, hitting Rex hard across the ribs. The dog yelped, but didn't let go. Ellie screamed, trying to grab the camera and crawl backward. The man swung again, and Rex released, staggering but still standing between her and the attackers. The first man kicked snow in Rex's direction, pulling a small knife from his belt. "Stupid mutt," he snarled. Before he could move, a light swept through the trees, a blinding white beam cutting across the storm. Voices shouted over the wind. "Police! Drop your weapons!" The men froze. Through the wall of snow came Deputy Morgan Hale, his flashlight steady, rifle raised. His green sheriff's coat was coated in frost, his gray eyes sharp and calm. Two other officers followed close behind, both younger men, faces hidden behind wool masks. Hale's boots crunched over the snow as he stepped between Ellie and the attackers. "Hands up! Now!" The men hesitated for half a second too long. Hale fired once into the air. The echo cracked like thunder. The men dropped their weapons immediately, hands raised. Ellie crawled to Rex. He was lying half in the snow, chest heaving, eyes glazed but still aware. "You're okay," she whispered, tears freezing on her lashes. "You're okay, boy." Hale knelt beside her, checking Rex quickly before turning to the girl. "You hurt?" Ellie shook her head, clutching the camera tight. They said the officer was dead," she stammered. Hale's expression darkened. "Not yet," he said quietly. Moments later, Tommy appeared, breathless and terrified, leading one of the search team members who had found the cave. Behind them, two medics carried Henry on a stretcher, his face pale but still alive. Rex whimpered softly at the sight, trying to lift his head. "Easy, boy," Hale murmured. He looked toward the two captured men, now handcuffed and kneeling in the snow under a deputy's watch. As he stepped closer, the beam from his flashlight fell on one of their faces, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a thin scar on his jaw. Hale froze for a moment. "I know you," he said. The man smirked despite the cold. "Guess you do." It hit Hale like a wave. 10 years ago, Pine Creek's biggest case, an illegal logging operation shut down after months of investigation led by Henry Lawson. The company's foreman had vanished before the trial, leaving questions buried as deep as the stumps in the forest. Now, here he was, alive, half frozen, caught again in the same woods. "Looks like your old man's still in our business," the man sneered. Hale's jaw tightened. "And you still don't know when to quit," he replied, signaling the deputies to take him away. The storm raged harder as the rescue convoy prepared to move. Snowmobiles lined up near the trail, headlights slicing through the whiteout. Ellie sat beside Rex, wrapping her scarf around his body as best she could. Tommy stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder. Henry was loaded carefully onto the back sled, still unconscious but breathing stronger. Hale gave the order, his voice steady against the storm. "Let's get them home." As they began the long ride out, the forest seemed to close behind them, the wind howling its last defiance. The blizzard swallowed their tracks almost instantly, as if hiding the evidence of what had happened. Far away, in the quiet of Pine Creek, Sarah Brooks knelt alone in the small church at the town's edge. The candles flickered in the dim light, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Her hands were clasped, her lips moving silently in prayer. Outside, the storm's voice carried faintly, and for a moment she thought she heard a sound, the gentle chime of the wind bells that hung by the door. It was said they only rang when a life was spared. Her breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't know why, but somewhere deep inside she felt it. Someone had been saved. Back in the storm, the final image lingered. Rex lying beside Henry on the sled, both battered, both alive. The dog's head rested on the man's arm, eyes half open, watching the endless white ahead. Two survivors, one human, one faithful, carried out of the forest that nearly took them. The snow in Pine Creek had begun to melt, though the mountains still glimmered under pale sunlight. A week had passed since the storm, the kind of week that made time feel both heavy and strangely fragile. The hospital on the hill, small and white-bricked, sat surrounded by pine trees dusted with frost. Inside, the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint sweetness of winter air. Henry Lawson lay in a recovery room by the window, bandaged shoulder propped on a pillow. The morning light stretched across the room, revealing lines on his face carved deeper by time, but his eyes, those cold blue eyes, held warmth again. Beside the bed, Rex lay curled on a soft blanket. His black and tan fur was shaved in patches where stitches lined his ribs. Despite the weakness in his body, his amber eyes stayed fixed on Henry, every breath syncing with his master's. A nurse entered quietly, a middle-aged white woman named Nora with sandy blonde hair tied back neatly and soft eyes that had seen too many winter injuries. She was gentle but firm, the kind who spoke little yet carried calm like a promise. "Your partner's quite the hero," she said with a faint smile, glancing at Rex. Henry looked down at the dog, his expression a mix of gratitude and ache. "He always was," he replied. His voice was rough, but steadier now. On the bedside table lay a folded newspaper. The headline stretched in bold black letters. 2 children and a dog-save officer. Smuggling ring broken in Pine Creek. Below it, a grainy photo showed Ellie and Tommy standing beside Hale, bundled in oversized coats, with Rex wrapped in a blanket between them. Henry stared at it for a long time, then exhaled slowly. "They're the real heroes," he murmured. At the same time, in another wing of the hospital, Deputy Morgan Hale sat in a narrow office lit by a single desk lamp. Papers, maps, and an evidence recorder lay spread across the table. His green sheriff's jacket hung on the chair, revealing a gray shirt beneath, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His dark hair was unkempt, and his stubble had grown thicker over sleepless nights. The man had the weary look of someone who'd seen more truth than he wanted. Across the desk sat Agent Riley Quinn, a white woman in her early 40s with sharp features and short auburn hair tucked under a black coat. Her gray eyes were observant, her posture straight, the kind that carried the quiet authority of state investigation. Hale pressed the play button on the recorder. Static filled the air, then a man's voice crackled through. "Make sure the truck's gone before Lawson finds it. He can't trace this back to me." The voice was low, familiar, and cold. Hale's brows furrowed. "That's not one of the smugglers," he said softly. Quinn nodded. "No. We ran the voice through our archives." She slid a folder across the table. "It matches a retired officer, Daniel Kersey, served under Lawson 15 years ago. Suspended for corruption in EO9. Disappeared after his hearing." Hale leaned back, his jaw tightening. "He's been here. All this time." His gaze shifted toward the window where snow began to fall again, thin and lazy now, as if the sky was remembering the storm. "Henry's not going to take that well," he muttered. Quinn closed the file. "He doesn't need to. We will." Back in town, the rhythm of life was returning. The small bakery on Pine Street smelled of butter and cinnamon again. Sarah Brooks, the 35-year-old mother with soft brown hair and weary hazel eyes, stood behind the counter wearing her flour-dusted apron. Her hands moved gently as she arranged loaves of bread, the kind of motion that came from years of repetition, and quiet strength. The shop's windows had been shattered during the storm, but now they shone with new glass. On the door, a hand-painted sign read, "Open again. Thank you, Pine Creek." A few townsfolk gathered, smiling as Sarah handed them pastries fresh from the oven. Behind her, a new donation box sat beside the register, labeled Community Fund. Thank you for believing. She never asked who had left the envelope of cash under her door, but she had her suspicions. In the corner of the room, a small card tucked inside the bouquet of winter lilies read, "For hope and for bread, M.H. and H.L." Outside, children played in the melting snow, and among them were Tommy and Ellie, both bundled in their usual coats. Tommy, now walking with a sense of quiet pride, carried a red first aid kit slung over his shoulder. Hale had made him an official junior volunteer trainee, something that lit a spark in the boy's chest. He practiced every chance he could, bandaging his sister's arm, learning knots, even carrying Rex's leash when they visited Henry. Hale saw himself in the boy, the same stubbornness, the same need to do what was right even when it hurt. Ellie had become something of a local celebrity. Her photograph, titled "Light in the Snow," had been displayed in the community hall. A black and white capture of Rex lying beside Henry in the snowstorm, his head resting on the officer's arm while headlights shone faintly behind them. The judges said it carried more heart than any professional work they'd seen. She didn't talk about the night much, but when people asked, she always said the same thing. It wasn't just light, it was hope. That afternoon, the town square filled with quiet excitement. The sun was sinking behind the hills, turning the sky into streaks of gold and lavender. In the center stood a small podium draped with the Pine Creek banner. Henry, still pale but steady on his feet, stood beside Hale. His left arm rested in a sling, and the lines on his face seemed softer now. Sarah stood near the front with Tommy and Ellie, her eyes glistening. The mayor, a kindly older man with white hair and a rounded frame, stepped up to the microphone. "Tonight," he began, his voice warm and slow, "we honor those who reminded us what courage truly looks like. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it wears a red beanie. Laughter rippled through the crowd. He smiled. And sometimes it has 4 legs and doesn't need words at all. The crowd cheered as Rex was led forward by Hale, wearing a clean collar and a shiny brass tag. A local veterinarian, Dr. Marion Collins, a white woman in her late 50s with gray streaks in her auburn hair and kind eyes behind thin glasses, approached with a small velvet box. She knelt down and pinned a round silver medal on Rex's collar, engraved with the words, "For bravery and loyalty, Pine Creek." Cameras flashed. Ellie clapped wildly, tears streaming down her cheeks, and Tommy grinned so wide his face hurt. Henry looked down at Rex and whispered, "You've earned more than medals, old friend." The dog tilted his head slightly, as if he understood, his tail wagging weakly. The townspeople applauded, their voices rising like warmth against the evening chill. For the first time in a long while, Pine Creek didn't feel small. It felt whole. As the crowd dispersed and lanterns lit up along Main Street, Hale lingered near the edge of the square, watching Henry talk quietly with Sarah and the children. His breath fogged in the fading light. Quinn approached from behind, her hands tucked in her coat pockets. "You're not staying for the press?" she asked. Hale shook his head. "No, let them have the moment." She looked toward the group and smiled faintly. "You ever think some stories still end the right way?" Hale exhaled slowly, watching Rex nuzzle against Henry's hand. "Only when they start with people like them," he said. The bell tower rang 6 times over Pine Creek. The air shimmered with laughter, music, and the faint aroma of bread drifting from Sarah's bakery. Life, once buried under snow and fear, was breathing again. A month had passed since the storm. Pine Creek had begun to thaw, its hills glistening under the gentle warmth of early spring. The river that once carried blood and snow now flowed clear again, whispering softly against the rocks as if erasing what had come before. The town, too, seemed lighter, its windows open to sunlight, its streets humming with laughter and the smell of cinnamon drifting from Creekside Hope Bakery. Henry Lawson stood across the street, leaning slightly on a wooden cane though he no longer needed it. The 58-year-old officer looked stronger now, his posture proud, his gray hair trimmed neatly. The lines on his weathered face had softened, not from age, but from peace. Rex trotted beside him, his fur glistening black and tan once more, a small patch of white fur where the scar healed. Around his neck hung a new tag, engraved with the words, "Pine Creek Rescue. Hope lives here." Henry took a slow breath and crossed the street toward the bakery. Inside, Sarah Brooks was arranging trays of fresh apple pies, her brown hair tied up in a loose bun, her cheeks pink from the warmth of the ovens. She looked up as the doorbell chimed. "Officer Lawson," she said, her voice soft but filled with joy. "You look like someone who finally got some rest." He smiled, that quiet kind of smile that came only after surviving storms. "Just Henry now," he said. "And yes, for once, I did." At a corner table, Tommy and Ellie sat side by side, homework scattered between mugs of cocoa. Tommy, now wearing a small red rescue trainee badge on his jacket, looked up eagerly. "Hey, you made it!" he exclaimed, almost knocking over his cup. Ellie, her long brown hair tucked behind her red beanie, grinned and held up her vintage camera. "Don't move. I'm taking one for the scrapbook." Henry laughed and sat down as Sarah brought over a warm pie, the crust golden and crisp. "On the house," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Consider it fuel for heroes." He looked around the bakery. The once small shop had grown. New shelves, new tables, and a fresh sign above the window that read, "Creekside Hope Bakery, dedicated to Rex, who reminded us that hope has 4 paws." Henry's eyes lingered on the sign and his throat tightened. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured. Sarah smiled gently. "We didn't have to, but we wanted to. He saved more than just you that night. He saved all of us." Rex wagged his tail as if agreeing, pressing his head against Henry's knee. Henry reached into his coat pocket and took out a small box. "I came here for something," he said, setting it on the table. Inside gleamed the medal he'd received years ago for valor, a golden badge, slightly tarnished by time but still shining beneath the bakery lights. Tommy's eyes widened. "That's your medal," he said softly. Henry nodded. "It was, but I think it belongs to you now." Ellie shook her head. Quickly, her voice small but sure. "We didn't do it alone." Henry smiled. "That's why you'll share it, with Rex." He turned toward the dog, scratching behind his ear. "You three remind me what courage looks like when it's pure." The bell above the bakery door rang again as Deputy Hale entered, his sheriff's badge catching the sunlight. The 32-year-old officer looked cleaner, sharper, his dark hair combed back, his uniform freshly pressed, but the same determined calm in his gray eyes remained. "You're not giving away medals without me, are you?" he teased, walking over with an envelope in hand. Henry grinned. "Only sharing the credit." Hale placed the envelope on the table. "City Council approved it this morning. You're officially our new training advisor. We could use your experience teaching the rookies." Henry raised an eyebrow, amused. "Retirement didn't last long, did it?" "Guess Pine Creek still needs you," Hale said, glancing at Rex with a smirk. "Both of you." The afternoon carried on in laughter and light conversation. Sarah offered slices of pie to passing customers, Tommy proudly recited what he'd learned in rescue drills, and Ellie showed off the photo that had won her the student award. Rex and Henry lying side by side in the snow, captured forever as the light in the storm. Later that evening, the town gathered near the edge of Pine Creek for a small ceremony. The sun was descending behind the hills, painting the water in hues of gold and amber. Lanterns hung from tree branches, swaying gently in the breeze. Children's laughter echoed across the clearing as townsfolk placed small candles along the riverbank, each one representing gratitude for someone saved or someone remembered. Henry stood near the center, dressed in his old sheriff's coat. Hale stood beside him, reading the town's proclamation. "For service, courage, and compassion that restored the light to Pine Creek, we honor Officer Henry Lawson, Deputy Morgan Hale, and the Pine Creek Rescue Volunteers." The crowd applauded, and Ellie and Tommy stepped forward with Rex between them, wearing his shiny medal once more. As music played softly, a violinist named Margaret Lowell, a slender woman with silver hair and kind eyes, performed a tune that sounded like both farewell and beginning. Henry felt something loosen in his chest. The river reflected the flickering candlelight, and for a moment, the world seemed perfectly still. After the ceremony, the townsfolk lingered by the water. Tommy practiced tying rescue knots for younger kids, his hands clumsy but eager. Ellie let a candle float down the creek, whispering something too quiet for anyone to hear. Hale stood talking with Sarah near the food stand, both laughing at a joke that only tired heroes understood. Rex sat between Henry and the children, his head lifted toward the evening sky. A faint breeze stirred through the pine trees, carrying the scent of melted snow and wood smoke. Henry reached down, resting a hand on Rex's back. "You brought us all back, didn't you?" he whispered. The dog's ears twitched in answer. As twilight deepened, Henry looked toward the horizon, where the last light of day shimmered through the trees. "You know," he said softly, his voice warm with thought, "when I was lying out there in the cold, I thought it was over, but maybe God was just giving me a reason to start again." The children fell quiet beside him, their faces turned toward the glowing sky. "Sometimes," Henry continued, "miracles don't come as thunder or light. They come as a hand reaching out, a bark in the dark, or a small light that refuses to go out." The pine trees swayed gently as if nodding in agreement. The creek whispered beneath them. And in that quiet space between day and night, between loss and grace, Pine Creek found peace. Sometimes miracles are not lightning or fire from the heavens. They are quiet moments, like a child's courage, a mother's prayer, or the loyalty of a dog who refuses to give up. God works in mysterious ways, often through the smallest hands and the gentlest hearts. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes that kindness can change the world. Leave a comment below and write Amen if you believe that every act of love is a small miracle. May God bless you, your family, and all who still carry light through life's darkest storms. Stay kind, stay faithful, and never stop believing in hope.